Loibner-Waitkus.
Okay, I'm outside again in the sun in sunglasses, and with dogs barking and construction and mowing and all that stuff going on. So I apologize. And there's a fan over to my side. So if that annoys you, I apologize. I'll also be looking off to the side to some notes that I have on specific stuff. This video I addressed last time that I would combine cameras and lenses, chapters 1 and 2, into one lecture rather than try to, split it in half since they relate to each other. And I'm going to talk pretty vaguely here, but I want you to get you need to read those chapters because they get a little more in depth than I will, but I kind of want to do my approach to how I teach how cameras and lenses work in sort of a general sense. And so the first thing that you need to understand, we need to go back to a little bit of history of cameras and how it all started. And with the invention, the daguerreotype, which, look, in the first photograph taken in history is the first daguerreotype is in the Ransom Center at the University of Texas. So if you're ever in Austin, you can go by and see it. The way in which cameras worked was someone discovered silver, a silver compound when exposed to light would sort of stay, and the part not exposed to light, through chemical process, you could wash away, which led to negatives. Okay, so you have light, and understanding photography is really about understanding light, even with digital photography. You have light. So for instance, see this sort of, wrong side. See this sort of, lighter spot on my head. There's a little bit of a white you can see on the chair behind me, and that sort of stuff. That would, anything that's lighter in this photo, or think about me here, would appear on the negative, would be left on the negative through the chemical process. Anything that's black, like this part of my shirt or my sunglasses, would be clear, would wash away. Nothing would be exposed, it wouldn't stay on the negative. So that the opposite, again, a negative, would be created. Then what you would do is go into a dark room, take the negative after you'd processed it, put it in what we call an enlarger, and then underneath that, you've seen these in old movies, underneath that would be the paper that we printed on, which acts exactly like a negative except on paper, so that where light's exposed, it would stay. Where dark is exposed, it would wash away and stay white. And so what you would do is you're creating a negative of a negative, which creates a positive. And so that's what would create the black and white photograph. Eventually, we discovered how to do this with color and paper, and with the opposite color, and create a negative of that. And then ultimately, when digital cameras came out, they replaced film with digital sensors, and that's where megapixels come in. Those are, 1 megapixel means a million of those tiny little pixels, right? Those little dots. And so you have, a camera with 6 megapixels, you can see how many that is, or 32 megapixels, or whatever. Now, one of the things, if you're buying a camera currently, you're going to buy a camera in the future, that kind of thing, don't get too hung up with megapixels. Most cameras are going to give you what you need. You really want more to worry about your lenses, your focal length, your f-stop, and those things. When I go to buy a camera, and again, I have one that I use professionally or for more important things that I shoot. But when I go on vacation, I don't want to carry around my giant camera bag with all the lenses and everything. And so I've over the course of, the last 10 years, have gone in and bought 2 or 3 small digital cameras. Again, I measure, oddly enough, a camera. I don't want a camera for vacation that's any bigger than a pack of cigarettes. I want it to be able to fit in my pocket and not have to worry about it falling out. Not worry, again, while I've gone through so many, I don't want to have to worry about it getting lost or destroyed. And of course, salespeople, when I go into Best Buy or wherever, always want to talk megapixels with me, right? They want to sell me the camera with the most megapixels, and it's just not that necessary. I shoot with, once you hit 6, 7 megapixels, you're going to be able to, certainly on a computer, to blow it up large enough, but even to print it, an 8x10, you'll easily be able to get that where you won't be able to see any digitizing, right? I've had people be like, oh, this camera has 32 megapixels, you need it. And I'm like, why? Who needs, what am I, is it a billboard that I'm going to put this photo on? So there's really just no need to get too hung up with that. Okay, so again, don't let that be the determining factor. It's the other things here I'm going to talk about: f-stops, really maybe shutter speed, flashes and stuff that you're really more concerned with when it comes to buying a camera and that kind of thing. Now, to understand how a camera works, you have to understand, like I said earlier, light. Okay, light has to be allowed in and shown and put on that sensor. And so, what a camera and lens in tandem do is control not only focus. Okay, that's important, but light, how much light is allowed in and for how long. And so again, the more light that's allowed in, not the better the image, but you need the right amount of light to capture it. Too much light, your photo will wash out. Too little light, your photo will be too dark. Okay. The other thing that it does, and that's controlled by f-stop, right? We'll get back to that. And shutter speed. So again, how long it's exposed. Now, the longer you expose it, in most situations, could be a little better, right? You want the more light you're allowed in, maybe the better the image. That really does. It's really not true, but the point is, you need an ample amount of light. So that's what shutter speed comes in, and the f-stop. But with shutter speed too, it has to be fast enough to stop it. So that if somebody's running, if somebody's moving, if your shutter's open too long, they're going to blur. Or you may move, right? As a photographer, nobody can be perfectly still. Okay, so we control that. That's what shutter speed does. F-stops relate to what we call aperture, and that's how big that hole is in your lens. The smaller the number, okay, everything in photography has to be the opposite, okay, just because they're based on fractions. And so where if I said a 22 f-stop, that would be a tiny, tiny pinhole. Where if I said a 1.4 or a 2 f-stop, that's a much larger opening in that lens to allow more light in, okay? So basically, these things combine to level out the exposure so that you get the correct exposure on your image, and you control blur. Okay, we call this the law of reciprocity. Your f-stop plus your shutter speed have to be working in tandem so that you're exposing the perfect amount of light to get the image that you want, but also shooting it quickly enough to stop whatever image it is and control blur. Okay, and that would again depend on the situation. Again, you would want a faster faster shutter speed if you were shooting sports, let's say, and so therefore you would have to open up your f-stop more, okay? Whereas opposed to a portrait or your object where something is still, since there's no movement except for your movement, you could shoot with a slower shutter speed, okay? Which would mean that your f-stops could go down. Okay, could be your opening could be smaller. Now, where f-stops come in, and what makes this kind of important is a concept we call, and this will come up again and again and again. It's called depth of field. Okay, what depth of field is? Think about in terms of you go to the eye doctor. Okay, and you'll probably do what I do, which is they tell you bring someone to drive you. You're going to have your eyes dilated, and I lie and say no. Right? Oh yeah, sure. There's somebody out. My mom's outside waiting for me in the car, which in the case I'll drive home. And you'll notice when your eyes are dilated, it's hard to focus. But if you focus on the road, you're fine. Your eyes can kind of focus on the road, but when you look down at your speedometer, which is up close, it's out of focus. And so by the time your eyes can adjust and actually see that and focus, then the road has become out of focus, okay? And so the wider the opening, the dilation of your pupil, the less the depth of field. What that means is the less is in focus in the photograph, okay? Now this is something that can be a problem, or it's something that can actually be used to your advantage. So again, what all can be in focus? So again, I could have a person standing 5 feet away from me and a person standing 50 yards behind that person, and if I was able to get them both into focus, okay, that would be a very, very large depth of field. The key there, though, would be my f-stop would have to be very, very small, meaning my shutter speed would have to be a little slower, right? Whereas opposed to if I wanted to throw the person 50 yards behind the person in front of me completely out of focus, I could open up that f-stop, right? Make that number small so the opening is really, really large. and that would throw the background out of focus. And so this is one of the things that you want to consider when you're shooting stuff. And again, there's two ways you can control this. You can control this by opening your aperture more to make things more out of focus, or closing it more to make things more in focus, or you can kind of trick your camera, and if you make your shutter speed faster, if it's on sort of an auto setting or shutter priority, you make your shutter speed faster, what that's going to do is it's going to, through the law of reciprocity and the way your camera works, is it's going to say, uh-oh, I'm taking a fast photo based on this lighting, I better open up that f-stop more, and so you're going to get a much smaller, shallower depth of field. Whereas you could trick your camera into thinking that you were taking pictures of something that wasn't going to move, and it would open up, it would slow down that shutter speed, which would open up would shut your aperture a little more. And so think of it that way. Again, one of the things I do with my students in class is I have them, I mean, we don't do it as a group, this would be kind of creepy, but one of the assignments is to go home and do the trick we used to do as kids, where you go in the bathroom and turn off the light. You look at yourself in the mirror, and then you turn off the lights, and you wait 30 seconds to a minute, and then you get right up in the mirror when you turn them back on, and you watch what happens to your eyes. Your pupils go from dilated, because you're in the dark, to really, really, tiny pinholes because you're exposed to that light. And that's exactly how aperture and f-stops work in your camera. So again, think of those two things. Now, while we're on that subject, the other thing is ISO. And again, it's funny because when you crop photos, in Photoshop or in Elements or in any real program, even on your iPhone, I think, it shows this little thing that looks kind of like this, right? And that was a cropper from the old days. It was a sort of this weird thing we kind of turned knobs on, and it basically it showed people where to enlarge and that kind of stuff, and you would use a grease pencil on it, and somehow that stuck around, and that's the case with a lot of things in photography. ISO is the thickness of film, even though we've taken that number and applied it to the way in which the sensor on your camera works. So for instance, and again, everything's opposite in photography. So 100 ISO film would be really, really, really thick film, which would need to be exposed to light a lot longer. So it would be like the film that we would use on a sunny day. Okay, and everything generally ISOs are doubled for whatever reason, and so 200 would be half the thickness of 100, but still would give you, you'd still have to have more light. Then 400, then 800, then 1600, then 3200 was about as fast as film could go and still get usable images. And one of the things that you give up there is the thinner the film, right, the higher the ISO, the less light needed to expose it, but what you gave up was quality. And so if you shot with 3200 film, if you shoot with 3200, what you're going to get was what we would call a grainy photograph for the most part. You're going to be able to see those little dots on there, but that's what you had to give up in order to, you had to kind of give up quality in order to shoot, let's say, a basketball game in a gym that's a little dark and people are moving. So in order to shoot with a fast shutter speed, you had to give up the thickness of the film. So that's what that ISO is. So again, you want to consider that if you're ever manually setting your ISO on your camera, know that with 100, you're going to have a relatively slow shutter speed. And so that would only be in sunny situations. With 3200, you're going to have a really, really fast shutter speed, but the quality of the image is going to be a little grainy or a little more pixelated and that kind of stuff. Again, when I shot with film, as a general rule, unless I was shooting sports, I shot with 400. That was, could use outside, could use indoors, could use a little bit in sports if there was enough lighting. And so I generally just shot, 400 for every day, right? 100 if it was a portrait, maybe 200, depending on the situation, and then 3200 or 1600 for sporting events. So hopefully this is kind of making sense to you. With the other thing too with lenses, and again, don't freak out too much if you don't have a big expensive lens. My first high school photography teacher told me something that I used for years with students and with anybody I've talked to about photography, and that is the best lens in the world is your legs, right? If you just get closer, okay, that will help. Don't get too hung up in the lens size. But there are two kinds of digital cameras. There are DSLRs, which means digital, geez, my mind went blank. Single lens reflex, Jesus. And ZLRs, which are digital zoom lens reflex, yeah, cameras. And so what that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense when I'm telling you what they mean. An SLR means you can remove the lens and put in other lenses, okay? And this is your best investment if you're serious about photography. I think I opened the video, maybe. I did. I restarted this one because I kind of screwed up. My dog started barking. I mentioned, I think in the first time, that I've had some of the same lenses for more than 20 years from high school. Because I use Canon, they still work. Even though they were film lenses, I used them with film cameras, they still work just as well as they did the day that I bought them. And so that way, no matter how many different camera bodies I've gone through in my lifetime with Canon, all of the lenses still fit. So again, I shoot most of my shots to this day with the same lens I shot when I was 17. With a ZLR, that means the camera, has the lens in there and you can't remove it and change the lens out. And that's what most of us are going to have because they're much more affordable. The big thing when you're thinking about that is never pay attention to digital zoom. They'll put that on the box, 300 times digital zoom. That means absolutely nothing, because what digital zoom means is it's just zooming closer in to, basically it's cropping the photo more. And so what that means is it's kind of like if you took this, let's say you had my image right now on the screen, okay, as a photo. And behind me there's some sort of Indian god Buddha thing. I don't know. I didn't buy it. But I take a photo of, I want to take a photo of that, right? And so what a digital zoom would do is basically capture the picture of me, right? Everything that you see on your screen right now, but it would cut everything out except the statue thing behind me. Wrong side. Everything's backwards. Okay, over here. And so what would happen is it would capture that, but it would just sort of zoom in, see if I can do this, zoom into that little area of the photograph, but you would not, because it's digital, you're basically just taking this photograph and cropping in, so you're losing all of this other pixel space around here. Okay, so basically you're not doing anything that you couldn't do in Photoshop. You're just doing it within your camera, and you're losing a lot of those megapixels and other information that you need. What you're looking for with a zoom lens is optical. Optical zoom means the lenses itself actually get you closer to the action in a way. When it comes to SLR lenses, when it's a ZLR lens, it's generally going to say 20 times zoom, and they use times as their way. With we use millimeters to measure how SLR lenses work, the kinds that come and go. Think about it as 1 for every 100. That's not an exact proportion, but if you have a 100 millimeter lens, think of it as your, right there, 1 to 1. If it's a 200 millimeter lens, it gets you twice as close. If it's a 300 millimeter lens, it gets you 3 times as close. Now you're thinking, why the heck is this lens so expensive just to get 3 times as close when I can buy a digital $100 camera that has 16 times optical zoom, right? Wouldn't that be a $1,600 lens, which I could not afford for my SLR? And the answer to that question is, with an SLR, you're just getting your higher quality images, okay? That's what professionals use. It gives you just better images as far as the saturation, color, everything else that matters there. So think about that if you're purchasing a camera. If you're not going to be serious about photography, don't waste a whole lot of money on a DSLR. Get a ZLR camera. You just don't need a DSLR. It's a big investment. If you want advice, on what to buy, I will be more than happy. Again, I said earlier, I'll say this again and again. Professional photographers tend to be Canon people or Nikon people. I'm a Canon person, and basically that's simply because that's what I started with, and the lenses screw on righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, right? For whatever reason, Nikon screws on the opposite way, and it just seems silly to me. So I've never been really a Canon person, but I always recommend with a Canon, start off with a Rebel. I've never owned one, but it's what I always told my students, because it gives you the basic body that you need, even though it's not the quality of the more expensive Canon cameras. It gives you the body, and so you can start investing in lenses that will work on other Canons. You can start investing in flashes, in all the tripods, all of the accessories you buy for a camera. And then if you ever want to move up to a much more expensive digital camera, those things will still work. Okay, so that's depth of field. I'm gonna look through really quickly. And I'll give some samples of some things and do a post a PowerPoint presentation in my notes that kind of go through some of these things. And we'll get into some other things later, things with flash and those kinds of things, file saving and all of that, color. I'm kind of flipping through a little slideshow right now, but levels and that kind of stuff. But I think that gives you a pretty basic understanding of how cameras work. Hope that was helpful. And if you have any questions, call me. Thanks a lot.